Jenny. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Great. So I'd like to start with maybe, why don't you just introduce your main role at ANDE, what ANDE was, who the members were, how they collaborated?
Sure. So until recently, I was the managing director of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, or ANDE. And ANDE is a global network of organizations that invest in and support small and growing businesses and entrepreneurs in developing and emerging markets. So ANDE's members are investment funds, they're capacity development providers, foundations, universities, development finance institutions, basically the whole ecosystem that goes into supporting small businesses. And what brings ANDE members together is an overarching belief in the power of small businesses to improve lives. And whether that's through the job creation and wealth creation, or the social and environmental benefits, or some combination of those, it's really about businesses as engines of change. And so when I started with ANDE over 12 years ago, or almost 12 years ago, we were a very small organization that had been founded by a group of founding organizations that had started to realize that they were looking at international development in a slightly different way, and that they were all focusing on what came to be called small and growing businesses, and that there would be some benefit to coming together initially somewhat informally, and over time formally launching this network to share ideas, to learn from each other, but also to help build the global ecosystem for this type of work. And so as managing director, I did a little bit of everything. I oversaw all of our international chapters and international offices, and did a lot of work on just, helping to think through member programs and organizational management and help grow the organization.
The origin story that you touched on sounds really interesting. So really they came together informally, this group, and realized that the world could benefit from them building this network. And how do you describe the way that they connect with each other and collaborate versus in chapters, let's say, autonomously deliver support to these businesses?
I mean, it's a lot of different things. A lot of the sort of work that we as staff did was helping members to connect with each other one-on-one, to introduce them to other organizations that might be working on similar issues or facing similar challenges. But we also did a lot of group work through different types of working groups and learning labs. In-person conferences, back when that was the thing that we did, virtual conferences, trying to initially just create an opportunity for these organizations to come together and then sort of organically meet each other and foster collaborations. And then over time, we did a lot more to develop programs with them and do a lot more targeted approaches as well.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that there's an important convening part, and then in terms of kind of maybe a co-creation component, where when they came together and as they got to know each other, they started to generate their own activities amongst themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think, one of the strengths that ANDE always had is that we were seen as a neutral convener. And so we could bring organizations together who might be competing in some aspects, competing for funding, for investment opportunities, but help them sort of identify where there were some common themes that they could work on together. And the fact that we were a nonprofit and a network organization sort of enabled us to create that environment to bring them together.
Wow. So on that point of competition versus, if you want to say, collaboration, how did you thread that needle, and how do you get competitors to collaborate in a sustained way?
Delicately. But I think, the founders of ANDE really had a philosophy around, the saying of rising tides lift all boats, and recognize that coming together to work together on some of the challenges that they were facing as an ecosystem would make all of their individual organizations stronger. And so over the years, I think we did a lot as an organization to really identify what were those common challenges or opportunities that multiple different organizations might be struggling with, that there would be some benefit to them to coming together and sort of hashing it out together with other similar organizations. We also did that through different training programs or research programs where we would try and tackle things that were kind of a common theme. It didn't always work. And certainly, organizations kind of sort of came into that in different ways that made sense for them as an organization. But I think that sort of that collaborative thinking was really built into the DNA of the organization. And so we were able to build on that from the beginning and set that tone and expectation that that's what we were there to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe talking a bit about the role of trust or trust building over time. So would you observe if you bring together a group, a cohort, at first, maybe it's more sort of circling around each other, and that it really would take some time, across time. And if so, what sort of incubation period would you need for collaborations to happen where they can let down their guards and find ways to work together in sustained ways, as opposed to just saying they're going to do it?
I mean, it definitely evolved over time, and it depended kind of in the situation and the geography and what we were trying to do. I mean, particularly, I'd say in the early days of ANDE and in the early days of each of our regional chapters, there was a lot of value in just getting people in the room together because they realized that there were other organizations doing similar things, which they may not have even known. And that sort of aha moment of like, oh, we're talking the same language. People would often say when they would come to the ANDE annual conference for the first time, if I found my people, all of a sudden everyone understands what I'm talking about. Whereas they maybe had been going to some of the bigger conferences focused on, social impact or impact investing and not quite necessarily finding people who had that similar focus. And that continued to be a theme throughout. We really worked, particularly with the annual conference, which was kind of a flagship event, to keep it small and intimate. We always did it at a location that was a little bit outside of a major metropolitan city because we wanted people to stay there and be on site. And, I used to always talk about some of the best conversations happened late night in the pub or early morning walks before breakfast. And so really trying to be strategic about fostering that even as we grew, which became harder because more and more people wanted to come. And I would say the same, as each of our different regional chapters started as well. And obviously in each geography, there were some cultural differences around how groups built trust, but there was a lot of value, again, in just that bringing people together face to face and highlighting the things that they had in common that then allowed to have conversations that developed beyond that. But it was also one of the challenges, early on, people saw a lot of value. And then after they'd been coming to things for a while, it was sort of like, well, maybe we don't need ANDE anymore. And so we had to find other ways to show our value proposition or, try and remind them that they were still getting something out of just this network piece of it.
Your challenge was to find something to keep them engaged. Maybe talking a little bit more about what you would do to extend that sort of engagement period and whether maybe it's just an inevitable natural part of these ecosystems to have people cycle in and out over time.
I mean, we definitely saw a lot of that. I mean, we had such a diverse membership that it's hard to sort of pinpoint one definitive cycle, I think, of how an organization interacted with ANDE. And a lot depended on their finances and their ability to pay membership. If membership dues weren't a big challenge for them, maybe they didn't have to think about it as much. But for some of our smaller organizations, that was a big piece of their budget. They really needed to be able to show the value. Even if they felt it, they needed to be able to demonstrate that. We invested a lot over the years in really getting to know our members, figuring out different systems, internally, both technologically and just organizationally, to capture information about members, be able to really customize and provide sort of bespoke membership services. We very intentionally decided to keep the network, somewhat small. We never wanted to be 1,000 organizations because we knew that this sort of hands-on piece was very important. And a lot of it through the different chapters and also our different kind of working group streams, when we started bringing people together around common themes, then allowed us to go deeper with a certain subset of organizations and a geography or around a particular theme and show more value out of that. But I'd say it was a continual challenge, and still is. I'm not there anymore, but I know something that the team still thinks a lot about how do we continue to bring that value to members over time.
You've touched on something there about keeping it a level of intimacy and the ability for you and your team to be able to maintain a hands-on relationship with the network. So what were kind of the numbers approximately? Are there some terms of connectivity among members that preserves trust? Is there anything you can generalize about with that? And how do you then also, maybe related to that, think about the overall network structure with nodes, where sometimes, in your case, maybe it's the chapters and thematic groups, I'm just guessing, but where you do let people have that kind of smaller cohort and they're still part of the big city. So maybe talking a bit about this numbers and scale and intimacy and trust question a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that there's a magic number. So ANDE has around 300 members. And once we got into the kind of 250, I think, was around when we started setting as high of member targets, and we sort of said, yes, we want to be bringing new organizations into the network, but we're not, really going out with the strategy around trying to recruit more members. But those were still, 300 organizations globally, some with 5 or 6 staff in one country, and some with, hundreds of staff all around the world. And a big piece for us too is, early on in the trajectory of ANDE, we were attempting to become self-sustaining by membership dues. And that was sort of the goal in the first few years. And probably 3 or 4 years in, we realized that we would never be able to achieve the things that we as a network wanted to achieve based on membership dues alone. And so we actually changed the model, and we hired our first development director, and we started really looking at going after more philanthropic grants. And we had some. We were very fortunate to have some seed funding early on, and we'd gotten some foundation grants, but that really changed the target. So while membership dues have always been a very important part of the ANDE revenue model, we weren't only dependent on those. So we didn't have as much of that need to grow from a revenue standpoint, which really helped created other revenue generation issues. This is as easy, but I think sometimes for a larger organization that are really based on membership dues, they have this need to continue to grow numbers wise.
Right. And let's actually talk about resources. What my experience, and I don't know if this is yours, is that both funders and those who are creating these kinds of networks really underestimate, maybe like when you're doing a house project and you're going to paint your house, and you underestimate the amount of time and the amount of money it's going to take to do it, right? And I find that with networks, it's the same thing. And so what membership dues were not enough, and so you're pressed to you grow your numbers so that you can capture get enough revenue, and then the trade-offs with that, or you do the development work, the fundraising to raise funds. What is the resource requirement? Why is it rather intensive? I mean, we can talk about backbone, we can talk about other things, but why do networks like this need substantial amounts of resources to be effective and successful?
Because it takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
I mean, that, again, we were fortunate throughout ANDE's life to have some really key philanthropic supporters who really did understand the value of creating this network, the ones who put in the seed capital to get ANDE started, and some of our supporters over the years. But for those who weren't already sort of bought into this idea of network building and convening and ecosystem building, it's hard to quantify that. It's hard to say, all of these meetings, getting people together is actually going to lead to systemic change and improve lives. We were several steps removed from that. And so that was sort of an ongoing challenge to be able to tell that story to new supporters, to demonstrate it through, metrics and other types of impact assessment. And in particular, the work that we did was really staff intensive. Like, that was always our biggest cost, was our staff. And so, if you look at sort of percentages and budgets, and particularly with some of the larger development financing finance institutions and donor agencies and government agencies who have certain restrictions around what you can pay on overhead and what you can pay for senior staff. And, it's hard to explain that when you're not out in the field, running a water development project, you have very different sort of structures and cost centers, and being able to justify that. And for us in particular, because we were very hands-on and bespoke, we needed to have the staff to be able to cultivate that. And, one of the big strengths of ANDE over the years has been our research, but we had to build out the research team and, the ability to do that. And for us as an international organization working in 10 different countries, just the financial and administrative burden of being able to run an organization like that and manage all that funding grew over time as well. And so, being able to demonstrate the importance of that to funders is, I think an ongoing challenge for most nonprofit organizations, but particularly for a network building organization.
That's great. And how about maybe shifting a little bit back to the structure of ANDE and your chapters? I know that you played a very important role in the growth of the chapters. You have challenges sort of managing a balance between kind of chapter and global or central, and how do you kind of manage that so that you're not not being overly hierarchical at the same time you're kind of keeping everybody on roughly the same page? I imagine you had that challenge. I've certainly had that challenge myself in other contexts.
Yeah, definitely a challenge. And I think it was both a challenge and a strength for ANDE. I mean, so when we first started with this idea of creating regional chapters, and maybe to take a step back. So, ANDE launched officially in 2009. And by the end of 2009, we had gotten a bunch of organizations to join the network. We were, had our first annual conference. We launched our first investment manager training in 2010. We were sort of proving that our founders were right, that there was a niche to be filled by this organization. But it was happening largely at a global level, at meetings and conferences in London or in New York, whereas the work was happening on the ground in Nairobi and Mexico City and all around the world. And so we started playing with this idea of creating what we called at the time regional hubs and bringing members together. And we started very small at the beginning and said, we're going to put a little bit of money. It was $5,000 towards, if you want to hire a consultant or, host a meeting or do a conference or something, and you tell us where they should be. And we'll put a little bit of staff time, which was a little bit of me. I mean, at that point we were 2.5 staff. And we put an RFP out to our members and said, you tell us where we should start these. And so we had groups of members in various different geographies who said, we want to do this, and started meeting. But it was all member led at that time. And we realized pretty quickly that you can only get so far with a member-led chapter, because we were fortunate in the sense that many of the individuals who formed our local steering committees were heads of their own organizations, but they were heads of their own organizations. They had other things to be doing. And so when we started really looking into the idea of putting staff on the ground, we looked at various different sort of models and ways to do it. One, we looked at sort of hiring our own local staff in each of the geographies. We looked at franchising. We looked at sort of different types of partnership models, and ultimately ended up in a model where we leveraged our members to hire staff in geographies where we were not incorporated and didn't have the legal presence to do it, but we fully branded our staff as ANDE staff. So they might be legally employed by our member, but they were branded as ANDE staff. And so really set the tone from the beginning that we were this one organization and we were part of the same team, and really tried to enforce that over the years. But it certainly had its challenge. We often had the tension between HQ and chapters, and you don't understand and they don't understand, and who's making the decisions, where's the funding. And I think we did a lot to try and address that, but I'm sure talk to anyone on our team, they would tell you about the challenges probably still today. But we also had a lot of recognition from the beginning that the chapters were one of the most, if not the most valuable asset that we had as an organization, and really having this local connectivity and really being able to understand from the ground up what was happening in geographies where our members were working and the needs that they were needing, that they had, and continuing to foster that. And We hired local staff from the beginning. That was always part of our mandate. We had local steering committees who provided governance and oversight and advice to our chapter. So we really tried to build that into the DNA of kind of how we developed chapters from the beginning.
Those tensions are just the nature of the beast, and they're always going to be there if we're going to have these kinds of networks.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know any global organization that doesn't have
No,
those tensions.
no, it doesn't exist unless it's some kind of a totalitarian, in which case there are other very different problems. How did you and how should these networks assess their impact, and how is that different from kind of this traditional model, sort of linear approach to funding and outcomes?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, there are some pieces of it that are easy to measure: member satisfaction, member retention, member numbers, but that doesn't really tell the full story. It's really hard to measure collaboration, and even harder to measure results, particularly collaboration that builds over time. And there were certainly things that, we knew we had a role. Sometimes we had a direct role. We'd brought members together, or we'd funded a project, or we'd structured, something that members had done together. But oftentimes we were creating an environment for them to come together, and they might be meeting in other venues too, so how much could we even take credit for? And we tried various different ways over the years. I mean, right now, ANDE measures just collaboration across the network. So part of our annual member survey is we ask members to go through the entire list of all the other members and say, if they know other organizations, if they're working on projects, if they have joint funding. So we have some measure. I mean, again, you can't always say this is just because of ANDE, but we can say that this network is collaborating together. We've done a lot of tracking anecdotally and getting input from members about the types of collaboration. But it's really hard to measure that in any sort of broad systemic way to be able to point to one organization and say, if not for ANDE, none of these things would have happened.
Right.
But at the same time, and we were fortunate, some of the funders who've been involved with us over the years actually saw the impacts of that work with their other grantees and can point to, well, we helped to fund this galley research that ANDE did on accelerators, and we can see how our accelerator portfolio are using this, or how things have changed over time, or we identified this issue that we were seeing across the different organizations we were supporting, and then worked with ANDE to address it through some of the programming. And so they could kind of see that shift in the ecosystem, which is helpful.
Well, that's fantastic. And do you are you seeing a shift in mindset among funders? When you talk to, you've obviously had a set, especially earlier days, of enlightened funders who understood the value of networks and were willing to support you based on that. And has that population of funders who've made that shift grown, or is it stagnant, or what's your sense of that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it has grown, particularly if you expand beyond just networks for the sake of networks and think about our particular focus on entrepreneurial ecosystems and the importance of strengthening ecosystems. We've certainly seen a lot of shift in that over the years, both at the global level from donors and foundations recognizing the importance of that and wanting to invest in it, but also coming up locally in specific geographies. And so that isn't necessarily about funding a network per se, but that's a piece of it. And I think a growing sense of the value of networks and creating that, or through some of the programming and training and research of being able to be supportive of that. So definitely we've seen a lot more funders enter into the space, if you will. But at the same time, you see funders who are, interested in investing in the space, but maybe don't quite see, kind of how that fabric needs to be woven together. So it's been a lot of times helping to educate funders on the importance of, creating those enabling ecosystems.
What are the incentives to be really actively engaged? What are sort of the carrots and sticks that would get people, in terms of recognition, awards, being able to go to the global conference? I mean, how do you kind of incentivize people to really stay active in the network?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have a lot of sort of carrot incentives. I mean, we had scholarships so that our members in emerging markets could attend the conference. We gave priority on scholarships to individuals who are on our steering committees, but largely because we wanted them to be able to attend the conference, but also sort of a benefit of, serving in the steering committee
Mhm.
capacity. I mean, we did give out some awards at the conference. We had a, member of the year and several other things that we did. But one of the things we really tried to stress to organizations is you get as much as you give out of this organization, and you've got to show up. And that was actually one of the conversations we would often have, particularly with smaller organizations who were trying to decide if they could afford the membership dues. And I would always really try and emphasize it's not just can you afford it, it's can you put the staff time to it? Can you actually show up and participate? Because otherwise you're not going to get the value out of this, and it's a waste of money. And we certainly had that happen. An organization would come and pay their dues and then just never be able to really engage and not see any value out of it and drop after a year. And so we tried to really set that tone. But it was also a lot of, following up from our staff and calling and, are you coming to this event? Or, hey, we're working on this thing that I know is relevant to you. And, really getting to know members so we can kind of point them towards the things that would be most valuable.
Did you find a challenge in having members who looked at it maybe more from let's say, an extractive mindset, saying, I'm going to get in here, I'm going to be able to find funding or other things and, but,
Yeah.
not really put much in? And did you have to have rules in place around that, or is it just building a culture?
Yeah.
How did you mitigate for that problem?
Try and set expectations about how helpful that we could be. I mean, certainly joining the network gives you exposure to learning and meeting funders, but we can't guarantee it's going to lead to any kind of funding. And if that's the only reason you're coming in, don't join. And we would try and discourage that. But it happens, and we certainly lost members over the years that didn't find that through the network. But we really tried to set the tone with members who are fundraising that, you need to come in and build the relationships, and then they might lead to funding relationships down the road. We would, with our annual conference every year, we did kind of a new member welcome to kind of orient members who were coming for the first time. And sometimes we'd have one of our funder members come in and be like, okay, here's how you might approach me, and here's things not to do, and over the years, we actually did more and more kind of fundraising training for members that was led either by our staff, or we'd have different funder members come in and, talk about how do you approach my foundation. We would make connections for members to funders, but we always had the expectation that we would check with the funder first, sort of see if they wanted an introduction, help to pre-screen a little, try and get our members to do their own research. And one of the biggest challenges that we saw across time is, you had sort of the usual suspects within the ecosystem who knew how to work the system and had good grant writers and knew how to go after funding and were, often winning things or, getting access to funding, where you might have a smaller local organization that didn't quite have the capacity or the know-how and staff. And so we tried over the years to do stuff to help bridge that divide a little. ANDE right now is testing some pretty interesting models around some of our own funding programs about how we're changing that, or how they're changing that to, make it more accessible and remove some of those barriers, or think about different ways. And, this fits into a lot of the discussions around diversity and equity and inclusion. And, how do you think about that? But it's tricky. I mean, organizations need to raise money.
Yeah, sure.
You certainly understand where it's coming from.
And on that kind of inclusion question and membership dues, did you do any, if you would see that there was this disparity between those who could afford it and could then also have the staff to invest in it, and those who couldn't, do any kind of subsidies or recruit funders to actually offset costs for some types of organizations? I mean, how did you grapple with that question?
Yeah.
So you weren't just reinforcing the existing system, I guess.
Yeah, this has been a never-ending debate the entire time I was with ANDE, and I know it is one that is still going on. So from the outset, I mean, we had a tiered membership structure. And so organizations paid different levels of membership based on the type and location of organization. But we often got feedback that our emerging market membership, which was 2,500, was too high for a lot of organizations. And we, at various different times over ANDE's trajectory, really looked at changing that model. But part of the challenge for us is the dynamics that would create for us as an organization of needing to be able to service a lot of smaller organizations for less membership dues and sort of the balance. And we did a lot of modeling to figure out we really couldn't do that in a sustainable way. At least at the time that I was there. Having said that, we also spent a lot of time thinking about what were the things that we made accessible to non-members. And so how are we helping to build the ecosystem for smaller organizations? And it also goes a little bit back to the point I was making earlier about ability to engage, because what we often found was organizations that couldn't afford the membership dues also didn't have the capacity to engage in the way that you needed to in our network. Having said that, when I was leaving ANDE over this year, we were in the midst of really robustly looking at that same question again, particularly in light of some of the increased conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and trying to figure out if there was a new way to think about that, or different ways to do that, or create, access to different levels of engagement and support. So that very well may be changing as we speak. I no longer have that insider track. And we certainly did have, to the other part of your question, we had funders over time sometimes say they would pay first year dues of a member, to get them kind of exposure. And then it was sort of up to the organization to decide if they saw value over time. In fact, we have a group of members who joined this past year out of the Middle East that GIZ paid for their first year of member dues because they wanted to bring them into this global network and really get them connected. And so we'll see over time if that relationship continues.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think a lot of networks are grappling with exactly the same question. And it's really, how can we get everybody a seat at the table? And the intention can be there, but there are all these structural and economic factors, right?
Yeah, and basic, language, that's a huge thing as well. So.
Huge, exactly. So I do with global versus chapters, I guess global, lingua franca, English, and then are you the chapters in kind of national or regional languages?
Yeah, and a mix at the chapter level. It's both, but yes, certainly do a lot more local programming or communications in whatever local language. But the language at our global conference is English. The communications coming out of HQ. But we've been looking at over time, can we, using technology, change that, particularly as we expand into. Keep saying they, as ANDE expands into Francophone West Africa and other areas where you might not have as high of a level of English proficiency.
Well, this is really fast. We could go on for a long time here, Jenny. Maybe just wrap up with one final question is, you obviously have so many insights and you've had so much experience and you've seen ecosystems like ANDE's evolve over time. Do you have a sense of where all this is headed? Do you think these kinds of networks are going to become much more adopted and accepted and better financed, and institution systems might reconfigure themselves? Or are you maybe a little more clear-eyed about this is a tough one, a tough nut to crack, and it's going to maybe not happen as fast as we want, or even at all? I don't know where you are on the kind of spectrum of change.
Yeah, maybe a little bit both, optimistic and pessimistic. As I mentioned earlier, we've certainly seen new actors come into this space. Both at the basic kind of network membership association level, but probably more importantly at this ecosystem building level and understanding really the value of collaboration, and that's hard to do and takes time and really takes investment. And that's where I think there will continue to be more growth over time. I think networks for the sake of networks are going to continue to have to prove and reinvent themselves and come up with new funding models, or figure out ways to be more self-sustaining. But I think they will also, as ANDE has done, continue to build on all these other pieces that go with that may have more luck and from a funding perspective. So I'd like to think that's shifting and changing. At the same time, I don't know, we live in this incredibly isolationist world right now that's more and more fragmented. And so maybe there'll be more funding from those who see that as a problem, or maybe there'll be more and more, mini silos of ecosystems and networks being built. So it's hard to say.
It's a paradox. It's
Yeah.
very true. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. This has been fascinating. I'm sure that our viewers are going to love this conversation and love learning from you. I know
Well,
I
I
have.
hope it's helpful. And as I said at the beginning, I'm no longer at ANDE, but it is an amazing organization with lots of resources. So if you're listening and have questions, go check out the website, go become a member,
Yeah.
support ANDE, fund ANDE.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks for having me.